we've had quite a successful programme. And tonight's theme is actually apt because we're coming into, as everybody knows, another centenary, very important one actually in terms of the trade union movement in this country, and that is of 1914. And we've asked the question, on all of these forums have asked the question, and this one is, the topic is James Connolly and his relevance to today's working class in the eve of the centenary of the lockout. And we have two speakers here who have a great deal to say about Connolly, I would imagine. Sean Garland here has spoke in this very room on several occasions in relation to James Connolly, and Sean is very welcome here to Liberty Hall. We're delighted that he's actually here for the start, because as you all know, he's been through a very, very tough time, and we're delighted to see him here. And I know a lot of the people here in this room have campaigned in terms of making sure that Sean is actually here, so we're delighted for you to be here, Sean, and speaking on something that's very dear to your heart. We also have Brian Hanley, who's going to also speak on the topic. Not sure exactly what both speakers are going to say, but sure, that's what we're here for. Some of them don't actually speak to what we asked them to speak to, but they generally get there in the end. But before we ask Sean to kick off, we just want to thank all of the speakers that we've had during the year. I want to thank Darrell Dart, Michael Taff, Vivian Cullen from here from SIP2, Fergus Wheel in the audience as well spoke earlier in the year. We've had a number of other speakers as well, and we want to thank them all for what we think was a very successful year of forums sponsored by Look Left. So without further ado, we'd ask Sean to open up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Comrades and friends. If we ask ourselves, what relevance has James Connolly for us today, we must ask what has changed since Connolly's killing. Has capitalism, Connolly's sworn enemy, been defeated? Has the aims and objectives of Connolly been achieved? Has the working class achieved power? And of course, the answer to these questions is a resounding no. As we look back over the past 96 years since Connolly's execution, we can recall how very soon after his death, Mr. Damon de Valera made his infamous remark, "Labour must wait," to the convention in the Mansion House in 1917. And I can state very clearly today that Labour is still waiting. Let me also say it's not just the Labour Party to whom we are referring, the Labour movement, which has been attached to the Labour Party down the years. It didn't take long after Connolly's killing, less than a decade, for the Labour Party to start distancing itself from Connolly's aims and objectives. And one of the most difficult and essential tasks that Connolly had was in trying to develop class consciousness among the working class, to give them a sense of their own identity, to have them realise their own strength, and the recognition that they could and should be masters of their own future. Connolly had to deal with a class unaware of its own power, but also to fight ignorance, bigotry and intolerance, which the Roman Catholic Church in particular used to the full. If there are any persons today who doubt the relevance of Connolly, we need only look to the north and see how sectarianism is still rampant within the society. Connolly had to fight against leading unionist bigot W.E. Walker, who was a trade union official organised Protestant workers. We never sought the unity of workers, only to maintain the division of workers. Connolly's vision was a united working class, north and south. He never wavered from this objective in his struggle against the walkers and the employers who sought division of workers in order to maintain their power. And over the years, since this state was established, we've had a distortion of what passes for politics. The two identical reactionary parties, separated by personalities and pseudo differences, they're both serving the same class interest. One thing these two reactionary parties were united on, one issue, which was to ensure that James Connolly was written out of Irish history books. I cannot ever recall in my school days, in the late 30s and early 40s, of ever hearing James Connolly's name mentioned. This was obviously part and parcel of the agenda of the government and the church, which had such power and influence, and of course with the Roman Catholic Church dominating the educational system. The fact that these organisations went to such lengths to eliminate Connolly from our history is ample demonstration of how they feared and hated his legacy. From more than any other man, James Connolly, as an historian, rescued the working class from oblivion and gave it its place in the struggle for freedom. With the murder of Liam Mellows, the possibility of any leader taking up Connolly's policies and ideology was nil. It wasn't until the Republican Congress in the 30s that some effort was made to make workers aware of the nature of the enemy, capitalism, and was made to have workers aware of capitalism, and that the road to the Republic was to the defeat of capitalism. For a time, Congress was significant in its effort to organise workers on class lines and attempting to oppose Fianna Fáil's call as a shallow party, which it was, using slogans and side issues to con people. And they were aided in this by a very conservative IRA leadership, which rejected the proposal to adopt a radical programme concerned with workers' rights and to see capitalism as the enemy. And with the failure of the IRA to ally itself with the Republican Congress, it meant there was no prospect of renewing Connolly's policy of building a workers' alternative to capitalism. With the continued opposition of Fianna Fáil and the IRA leadership, the Congress was unable to maintain its momentum, and the best went on to fight in Spain against Franco's fascists. Where in Ireland, the IRA, under Sean Russell, went on to carry out a disastrous bombing campaign in Britain, and the following years saw history repeating itself, with many going to jail and some being executed. Over this period of time, and on down through the years, it is important to recognise the contribution of the Communist Party of Ireland it has made in keeping the name and legacy of James Connolly before the people as much as it possibly could. And this contribution to his struggle for freedom, for workers' freedom. And this is the point that we have often lost sight of, that down through the years, very dark and dim years of 40s and 50s, there were voices there who were trying to make Connolly's voice heard. The relevance of James Connolly is very striking. We look around this particular state and see how time after time the working class had been betrayed, and how could it be otherwise? The Labour Party being led by such leaders as William Norton, who split the trade union movement, or Brendan Corish, who when asked to clarify his beliefs stated, and he said, I quote, "First, I am a Catholic, second, I am an Irishman, and third, I am a socialist." It didn't start or stop with these men, but we had Michael O'Leary becoming leader of the Labour Party and then leaving the party and joining Fine Gael. Given its history, it is no wonder that such leading individuals in the Labour Party, such as Puncius La Rosa, can say that Connolly is no longer relevant today. With their history, poor knowledge of the group which called itself Democratic Left, and I might say they were neither democratic nor left, it was no surprise they took the Labour Party over with Rabbit first and now Gilmore. If we trace the history of the Labour Party, the party that Connolly founded, and in particular its participation in coalition governments with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, we can see the lack of principle and the triumph of opportunism. One thing is clear: over the years, Labour Party leadership, given the slightest chance, will never resist the lure of a seat at the cabinet table, or a ministerial car, or a pension. This is not to ignore the many members of the Labour Party who over the years have stood loyally by Connolly's principles, only to see these principles betrayed again and again by a parliamentary faction which sees nothing beyond, as I said, a cabinet seat. If the left has failed to achieve any of its objectives, capitalism has succeeded in expanding and consolidating its power worldwide. Despite having serious crises, as Marx predicted, capitalism will still retain the power to enslave billions of people in Asia, Africa, and also the so-called developed countries. The Soviet Union, which represented a new beginning for workers, and in its early decades it was a beacon of hope for the mass of humanity, and which made a significant contribution to the defeat of colonialism and imperialism, also fell to a combination of continuous subversion, attacks, and most serious of all, leadership, corrupt leadership, and a dominating bureaucracy. To all intents and purposes, China is going the same way, with all the sacrifices made over decades by millions of workers and peasants once again being for nothing. Peace, work, democracy and class politics are slogans under which the Workers' Party organised in the 70s and in the 80s. And many workers responded to the programme and activity of the Workers' Party at that time. These principles are still valid today. Betrayals and splits are common features of left politics, unfortunately. Hanley in his own day had to fight against opportunists and splitters in the ISRP, against such people as E.W. Stewart, Secretary of the ISRP, who eventually finished up supporting William Martin Murphy. Again, in reference to the relevance of Connolly today, the international scene provides more than enough examples of how important Connolly's international analysis was. He recognised that the First World War was a struggle for control between capitalist powers, in which the working class were once again the main losers. He famously stated, I quote, "The workers of all nations are my natural allies, as the native capitalist is my natural enemy," unquote. This is still as relevant today as it was when Connolly fought against the Redmonds and the William Martin Murphys, and all the reactionaries which sought and still seek to maintain a system which, in the words of Marx, the few exploit the many. I can recall Michael McDowell's remarks from some years ago when he said, and I quote, "Inequality is a good element in society," unquote. But naturally, Mr. McDowell does not himself feature among those who are suffering inequality. And in this context, the working class are daily experiencing today how capitalism always makes it to solve the crisis by imposing more and more draconian measures on the working class, whilst the class that caused the problems escapes with no penalties but rewards. In Labour and Irish history, Connolly, as I said, rescued the working class and gave it its own history and made the working class proud of its history. Connolly's view of history and the future of society remains valid for today and tomorrow. It is the working class which constitute the vast majority of humanity. It is the working class learning the lessons of the past which will, to the building of a class-conscious organisation, set itself and the workers of the world free. Thank you very much for coming.
Good evening. I'd like to thank the Look Left Forum for the opportunity to speak here tonight. I suppose I should warn at the start that I'm not an expert on the life of James Connolly, and there are numerous accounts of his life and his politics that are out there that are probably more insightful than a lot of things I'm going to talk about. But I do think that both as a historian and an admirer of Connolly in many ways, both James Connolly and the legacy of 1913 are of great relevance, both to today's working class and indeed to everybody in Irish society. And firstly, just to begin as a historian, I think central to Connolly's importance was the emphasis he put on class as a defining factor in Irish history. Labour in Irish history opens with Connolly writing, "Were history what it ought to be, an accurate literary reflex of the times with which it professes to deal, then the pages of history would be almost entirely engrossed with a recital of the wrongs and struggles of the labouring people. But history in general treats the working class as the manipulator of politics treats the working man, that is, with contempt when he remains passive, and with derision, hatred and misrepresentation whenever he dares throw off the yoke of social servitude. And Irish history has ever been written by the master class in the interests of the master class." And I think that's generally the picture today, just as it was when Connolly wrote. And I think the central importance of Connolly is that he does bring class to the heart of understanding Irish history. And this is important in the modern world as well, because one of the great conceits, one of the great myths of independent Ireland from the 1920s onwards was that class was no longer relevant. That class was something that you associated with the British aristocracy or with the landlords, and with independence or semi-independence, it had disappeared as a phenomenon within Ireland. Recently I was reading about the aftermath of Bloody Sunday in Southern Ireland, and there's a debate in the Dáil, and Brian Linehan, then Fianna Fáil minister, makes a speech in which he argues that not only is there no religious discrimination in Southern Ireland, but also that it's a classless society. And nobody in the Dáil interrupts him or says what you're talking about is rubbish, because there is a very common idea, widespread throughout Irish society, that essentially Ireland was a class society. It didn't have a land aristocracy anymore. But when you read Connolly and you look at the importance of what Connolly talks about, you see that class is still of central relevance. And for Connolly, without an understanding of class struggle, as he said, Irish history is but a welter of unrelated facts, a hopeless chaos of sporadic outbreaks, treacheries, intrigues and massacres. But with an understanding of class, Irish history is seen much more clearly as a struggle between the rich and the poor, between landlord and tenant, and finally between workers and capitalists. And the fact, of course, that James Connolly was a Marxist does differentiate his vision of a republic from those of his contemporaries. Connolly's idea of a workers' republic was a different idea than the republic of Pádraig Pearse and Tomás MacDonagh and Tom Clark, even though they were sympathetic in various ways to the idea of social justice. Connolly's idea of a workers' republic was also, of course, very different to that of his colleagues William O'Brien and Tom Johnson, who would dominate the labour movement in the years after his death. And it's even more different from some of those who later claim his legacy, such as Eamon de Valera. In 1926, when de Valera was asked after he formed Fianna Fáil what political figure in Irish history he admired the most, he said James Connolly. Now, many people today will find that hard to believe, but de Valera is only one of many people who've claimed Connolly's legacy, and we could probably have an interesting but maybe unproductive discussion on whether or not all these various people have a right or not to claim his legacy. But many certainly have done. But I think what's important about his writings is again this idea of class and class struggle as central to his conception of a republic. And when Connolly described Karl Marx as the greatest of modern thinkers, he was not simply paying homage to a then popular writer, he was actually explaining where his own ideas came from, and Marxism permeates Connolly's writings. And these ideas, I think it's also important to stress, aren't inspired by academic interest on Connolly's part. For Connolly, there wasn't any wealthy benefactor to fund these hours of research in the National Library, or to provide a quiet country retreat where he could apply the finishing touches to his writings. Connolly's ideas emerged from years of experience and involvement in working class struggle. And it is actually truly remarkable that Connolly's analysis of Irish history and society, labour in Irish history, the first history from below in many ways of Ireland, was written by a man who left school at 11 and who scraped, and literally scraped, a living for himself and his family, initially as a soldier, then as a carter, a factory worker, a cobbler, a journalist and trade union organiser in Edinburgh, in Dublin, Belfast and New York, often only managing to barely stave off abject poverty and beset by a whole range of family tragedies. And it is significant, I think, that Connolly is one of the very few Marxist intellectuals to actually emerge from the unskilled working class, and that is important. As Professor Joe Lee has written about James Connolly, nobody has overcome so many material obstacles to write so illuminatingly about Irish history. The quality of his insights obliges one to continue to wrestle with him. He asks big questions which remain of enduring relevance. And I think most people here will be familiar with some of the central ideas of Connolly's thought, so I won't dwell on them too much. But certainly from an early stage, when he talked about a workers' republic, the first manifesto of the Irish Socialist Republican Party in 1896 gives you a flavour of what he considered some minimum demands. The immediate nationalisation of the railways, canals and banks, the introduction of a graduated income tax, a minimum wage, a 48-hour week, free childcare, free education, public control of schools, universal suffrage and commitment to public ownership of the economy. And Connolly refused to accept that private ownership had any part to play in the economy. The wealth-producing assets of the community should be held by the community itself, and production and distribution of goods should take place under direct control of the community. There was no role for private capitalism in Connolly's vision because, as he said, the capitalist is a parasite in industry, as useless as any other parasite in the animal or vegetable world. The working class is the victim of this parasite, and it is the duty of the working class to use every means in its power to oust this parasite from the position which enables it to prey on labour. So Connolly is not just someone who many people in Ireland would see as a person who had a deep interest in social justice or even a trade union organiser. He is a Marxist, and he does believe class struggle is central to his view of the world. And he's not ambiguous about the means that the working class would have to use to bring about this new world. When the capitalist kills us so rapidly for the sake of a few pence, it would be suicidal to expect them to hesitate to slaughter us wholesale when their very existence as parasites was at stake. So if it were to come change, it would have to be revolutionary. Therefore, the working class was ultimately justified, as Connolly said, in using the weapon of force to dislodge the usurping class. So in many ways, Connolly's ideas shouldn't be sanitised. He is a revolutionary Marxist. He's also a syndicalist. He's obviously very interested in the whole idea of rank and file revolutionary trade unionism. He engages in it both in Ireland and the United States. His time in America, I think, is very significant as well. It introduces him, well, he's already been introduced to the idea of a working class which simply is made up of one ethnicity. In 1902, Connolly issues a leaflet in Yiddish to Jewish voters in Dublin. While in the United States, he works with German and Italian workers. He actually, learns some of these languages in order to work with them. And I think this is important in understanding his legacy for today as well. I think his vision of socialism is also significant, and it's a vision, I think, that does stand the test of time. First of all, I think his vision of socialism is inspired by his own experiences and those of his family, his friends and workmates. His writings about the condition that people lived and laboured in Dublin, his journalism in particular, in papers like the Workers' Republic, show a deep compassion and solidarity for the working class. Again, significantly, he's an early supporter of the idea of women's rights. He asks, what use can be the establishment of any form of Irish state if it does not embody the emancipation of womanhood? Not a universally accepted idea by any means, even within the labour movement in the 1890s and the early 1900s. He also warns that those who made a fetish of state control, that it wasn't enough to guarantee equality. He said to those that cry, make this or that the property of the government, he answered yes, but only in proportion as the workers make the government their property. So the conception of socialism Connolly believed in his own words, would destroy at one blow all the fears of a bureaucratic state, ruling and ordering the lives of every individual from above. I think this is significant in 2012. The experience of socialism on an international scale has disillusioned millions of people towards the idea of socialism, and unless it remains an idea of the emancipation of workers, I think it will always alienate many people even as it inspires others. So I think Connolly's view was a vision of a better society for the working class, not simply a better organised society. And his experience of rank and file trade unionism as well, I think, gave him a much clearer conception of working class democracy than perhaps other socialist writers who thought of the working class purely in theoretical terms. Because he saw class as a key division in Irish society, Connolly was scathing of simplistic nationalist notions of Irish history. And in Labour and Irish History, he describes the careers of various patriotic heroes of the past as not in fact heroic at all, but as attempts very often for them to maintain their land and privilege in Ireland and use them, use the Irish poor as their foot soldiers. For example, he talks about the Jacobites during the Williamite Wars fighting the English simply to keep their own lands of the native peasantry, not because of love of Ireland. And to those who define their politics by devotion to the concept of Ireland, Connolly famously explained, and people again will be familiar with this quote, "Ireland without her people is nothing to me, and the man who is bubbling over with love and enthusiasm for Ireland and yet can pass through our streets and witness all the wrong and suffering, shame and degradation without burning to end it is a fraud and a liar, no matter how pleased he is to love the chemical elements that he calls Ireland." I suppose in the days of being constantly told to put on the green jersey, that's significant as well. But Connolly did think there was a national question. He didn't ignore the fact that Ireland was part of the British Empire. And I think it's wrong to infer, as some scholars have done, and obviously some on the left as well, that Connolly's participation in the Easter Rising then is an aberration, that he abandoned socialism for nationalism in 1916. From an early stage in his career, Connolly argued that it would be impossible to achieve socialism in an Ireland that wasn't independent. He said the subjection of one nation to another, as of Ireland to the authority of the British Crown, is a barrier to the free political and economic development of the subjected nation, and can only serve the interests of the exploiting classes of both nations. And in the early 20th century in Ireland, there was no escaping the issues of self-government, no escaping the issues of republicanism and the idea of political independence, and Connolly didn't try to escape them. He argued there couldn't be a workers' republic within the framework of the British Empire or the United Kingdom. Of course, what he did argue was that the only people who could be trusted to carry through a fight for real independence were the people, he said, who had never betrayed Ireland, the working class. And again he argued that many people might call for Irish freedom, but only the working class would never let the cause of Irish freedom down. And in some of his writings then he tried to root this in the history of Ireland, for example, arguing that native Gaelic society prior to the Anglo-Norman conquest had been egalitarian, that there had been a Gaelic principle of common ownership, and that both feudalism and capitalism were therefore foreign importations. I think some of that is problematic, and that Connolly exaggerated this to an extent in order to try and win the argument. But he did argue socialism wasn't going to be achievable without independence, but also that independence would not be achievable without socialism. And again, he famously warned that if you remove the English army tomorrow and hoisted the green flag over Dublin Castle, England would still rule you. So in that sense, Connolly didn't stray, I don't think, from the path of socialism in 1916. He'd always seen the struggle for a workers' republic as being intertwined with national independence. But I think the context of why he took part in the Rising, and indeed some of what he argued in the lead up to the Rising, is important as well. It was the great failure of the European left to oppose the slaughter of the First World War, with a few exceptions, and the resulting then slaughter in the trenches, that convinced Connolly, I think, that he had no option but to throw in his lot with radical insurrectionist nationalism. And he didn't do so from a position of strength. Back to the lockout. Defeated in 1914, a huge defeat which further narrows the options for Connolly and others. Ironically, the lockout had seen people like Pádraig Pearse, Tomás McDonagh, Tom Clark was already in some ways sympathetic to Labour, take a more pro-Labour view, and this brings them together in some ways. But I think it's important, when you look at Connolly in that period of the war, he's not at his strongest, and I think he does. There's a famous slogan which we all know, and it makes a wonderful banner: "We serve neither king nor Kaiser but Ireland." But if you look at what Connolly's writing, especially during 1915, that isn't really his position. His position by 1915 is that Germany are the right side, and that Germany is a far more progressive state than Britain, and that he essentially he avoids any criticism of the German imperial state and their empire, and continually talks about how progressive the German social welfare system is, how important the Social Democrats are to German politics. And he does, I think, fall into a trap that many socialists have done, is that when things are bad, and they often are bad, to look for deliverance from abroad. And it's not simply an alliance of convenience in 1916. I think Connolly does basically think that somehow a German victory would be more progressive than that of the British. And I think it's something that should be discussed. After his death, Connolly entered the pantheon of Irish nationalist heroes. Again, as Sean Garland has pointed out, sometimes not emphasised. On other occasions he was emphasised. Train stations and hospitals named after him, various political movements claiming some element of his ideology. Often presented as a Republican with a social conscience or a dedicated labour activist, not usually presented as the Marxist that he was. By the 1960s there's a greater appreciation of Connolly, and there's also what I would regard as more nuanced criticism of some of his ideas as well. Connolly, of course, had worked in Belfast and lived in Belfast, and he's far from unique, even so, in failing to appreciate the depth of Ulster Protestant resistance to self-government, let alone independence. When Connolly had worked in Belfast, he'd realised that while in theory the highly industrialised proletarian city should be ripe for socialist organisation, in reality the working class was bitterly divided by sectarianism. He was convinced that Ulster Unionism was an ideology which only served, as he said, the interests of rack-renting landlords and sweating capitalists. And therefore, despite the progressive potential of North East Ulster, it had become the happy hunting ground of the slave driver and the least rebellious slaves in the world. But despite his belief that North and South would again clasp hands, as he says in Labour and Irish History, as in 1798, and that the pressure of common exploitation would make enthusiastic rebels of the Protestant working